Thank you very much. Good. Well, good evening to all of you and welcome. I'm Dorothy Hurrell, the Chancellor of the University of Colorado, Denver, and it really is delightful to see all of you here tonight, and what a great mixture we have. How many CU Denver students are in the audience? Wow, great. That's fabulous. And I think we're welcoming a lot of friends of the university and neighbors to CU Denver as well. This is a really special event that we are so honored to have on our campus. And it was made possible by two folks who are very, very connected to the University of Colorado, Denver, Drs. Lenny and Bob Damrauer. And they established this endowed series. Yes, thank you. They established this series in 2014, and they did it to honor their parents who didn't have the opportunity themselves to have a higher education, but they valued education. And certainly with the work that both Bob and Lenny have done in their lives, that those values run very deep in them. Bob has been with CU Denver since 1968, so he's our resident historian. I also sometimes call him our resident curmudgeon because he also, he speaks truth to power. There's no doubt about that, is there, Bob? And I happen to love that. So Bob is a professor of chemistry, a special assistant to the provost, and our associate vice chancellor of research. And what he really loves most, I think, of all the things that he does is mentor young pre-tenure faculty and really helps them navigate their academic path. And he is really adored by so many young faculty members on this campus because of that. Lenny is a longtime professor of chemistry as well before she took up a career in computer science. And she worked in information systems and was at the Children's Hospital of Colorado for 20 years. And when she left Children, she retired from there, she came to CU Denver, and she worked in our admissions office and was the magic behind making a lot of the connections between the data that we had there. And she has since retired from CU Denver, and we miss you, Lenny, as well. Oh, she is not retired. She's still working. Okay. Well, hey, because I thought that was in the works, was retirement. So we're glad to still have you here, Lenny, with us. That's for sure. So again, would you join me in thanking Bob and Lenny for this incredible gift that they've given to CU Denver? As it happens, we had to reschedule this lecture because the original date for it was March 13th, which was that horrific snowstorm that we had, the blizzard and all of that. And so it's wonderful that we are able to have it now and to have Dr. Klein with us this evening. After this lecture, I will come back up and acknowledge Dr. Klein, but also share a little bit about the next lecture that we have that's just a month away from now, and tell you a bit about that and hope that you'll mark your calendars for that as well. So tonight's speaker, we are so thrilled to have with us. He is Dr. Richard Klein, and he's a professor of anthropology and biology at Stanford University. And his expertise is in modern human origins. And so I was just talking with him for a moment before, and I said, so is the right word to call you a paleoanthropologist? And he says, yep, that's what the name of it is. And so I couldn't help but think to myself, at what point in your life, Dr. Klein, did you say, what I want to be when I grow up is a paleoanthropologist? I think that would really be fun to know. So he received his PhD at the University of Chicago. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the prestigious National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Klein researches the archaeological and fossil evidence for the evolution of human behavior. This is really going to be fascinating. He's done field work in Spain and especially in South Africa, where he's excavated ancient sites and analyzed these materials for 50 years. Tonight, he'll discuss the history and development of modern humans through technological and genetic changes that have enhanced our species. He was also sharing a bit that, and I expect he'll touch on this, that there is this interesting marriage when you take anthropology and biology, and not all people think that that's a great marriage to have. And so in my mind, it just makes such sense to merge those two fields as we really strive to understand much more deeply the evolution of the human species. And another claim to fame, and I was saying to Dr. Klein that, I'd love to get a little more time with him because he and Dr. Damrauer were roommates at the University of Michigan for 2 years. And so, all of us who know and love Bob Damrauer would like to know and would love to hear all of these stories. And Lenny was saying that they visited last night, and both of them claim that the memories are a little foggy for one reason or another. So anyway, please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Richard Klein.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? Great. Of course, if you can't, then what are you going to say? So, anyway, I should tell you a little bit about my subject before I get into it in more detail. If you're studying human evolution, which is what I've been doing for a very long time. In fact, didn't we have roommates who were Neanderthals? Anyway, and you're trying to make sense of what the record says. You've got artifacts, you've got bones. Increasingly now we have genes, including ancient genes. You make up a kind of a narrative, a story that seems to weave everything together in a sensible way. But it means that there can be lots of stories. And different people disagree on, the extent to which the evidence better fits one than another. So what I'm going to tell you this evening, is my story, which I think is probably close to correct. But you wouldn't have to go very far to find people who would say no, something very different. One thing, obviously there's another version, isn't there, completely outside the academic world. There's the biblical version, too, of where we came from. I won't be considering that. But nonetheless, well, I won't get into that. We all know about that. And I've had students who have objected occasionally to the approach that I take when they've been told something different in church. Putting that aside, if you're thinking about human evolution, we have these varieties of evidence, and in the past they've been excavated from the ground. Now you can get them out of the genome. But if you leave here this afternoon and you walk out to the parking lot or wherever you're going next, and you see something that looks like a plate, a saucer, come down from outer space and land, and they get out and they say, "We're anthropologists from someplace else, and we'd like to meet somebody that could tell us about how you do things." Back to the drawing boards on human evolution, right? Now, we never take that into account. Actually, there have been semi-serious attempts. Thor Heyerdahl actually thought about possible extraterrestrial intervention in human prehistory and in human evolution. And there are other people who've done that too. We generally just don't pay much attention to that. And obviously that won't be part of what I have to talk about tonight. What I wanted to talk about was the origins of modern humans. Now, what do I mean by modern humans? Everybody in this room, everybody on the planet today. People who look and behave the way we expect. You go into a room, your own, and a classroom or a restaurant or something, and everybody looks pretty much like you'd expect them to look, and they behave pretty much like you expect them to look. I would argue that if you go back more than 50,000 years, and you could bring people from that period, 50, 100,000 years, to Denver or to Palo Alto, where I'm from, and put them in a classroom or in a restaurant, there'd be some surprises. They wouldn't know exactly how to behave in a modern human context. So what is it that's unique about modern humans? Well, obviously we have very special cognition, our brains, communication. And the question is, when did this all happen? When did people who think and communicate the way we do, in the fullest sense, I don't mean sort of in a half sense, but in the fullest sense, when did they arrive? And I think 50,000 years ago. And I think the basis for that was genetic change, and I'll say more about that as I go on here. Now, that's speculative. I don't think that the idea that it happened, that there was an event 50,000 years ago that gave rise to modern humans, I don't think that's speculative, although some people would argue that it is. That you can, in fact, anything you can see today, you can see 1 million years ago or 500,000 years ago in the archaeological record. I don't believe that's true, and I'd be happy to elaborate on that a little more, maybe in a question period. What I put up here, I have lots of words, and my students would tell you that maybe I have too many. But in any case, just to make sure that I have, get everything out, I've sort of summarized this lecture right at the beginning here. So I've already said that, fully modern humans appear about 50,000 years ago. There's evidence in the fossil record for people who look something like us, and I'm going to show you a skull that I've got now, hasn't been published yet, that's older than 50,000 years, back to perhaps 200,000, some people would say 300,000 years in Africa. We have evidence for humans evolving there. We're all of African origin, and about 50,000 years ago, what happened was people who had evolved in Africa, who had become us, the species Homo sapiens, first left Africa, spread to Eurasia, and from Eurasia they spread elsewhere, eventually to, of course, Australia and the Americas. So that part, I think the idea that at about 50,000 years ago you get this expansion of modern Africans. There had been people in Africa for a very long time, and I think they became modern about 50,000 years ago, at least in their behavior. Already looked modern for a long time before that, but in their behavior became modern about 50,000 years ago, spread then to the rest of the world, eventually covering it all. I think that's the spread, at least, I think, is relatively uncontroversial. Now, there might be people here who would contest that, but I think that most of my colleagues, when I say most, sometimes people say, how many people think like you do? And I think, well, how many people are there that think at all about what the kind of thing I'm talking about? I mean, there are more people in this room tonight than there are paleoanthropologists, to use that term, people who study human evolution professionally. So it's a very small field, and if I have a view and the other 6 people who think about the same thing have a different view, because it's 6 to 1, does that make it more likely that they're right? No, the numbers are too small. Anyway, so between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, and the evidence is a little shakier than I'd like it to be, but we have evidence for the physical evolution, anatomical evolution, of people who look like us in Africa. And I'll show you a little bit about that as I go on here. And then at about 50,000 years ago, Ka, incidentally, which you're going to see repeatedly here, just a convenient abbreviation for thousands of years ago. About 50,000 years ago, people who were now not only looked modern, but were behaving in a fully modern way, and I think the behavior was very important in this, spread from Africa to the rest of the world. I think the behavior is what allowed that. Now, how do we know about this change in behavior at, say, 50,000 years ago? Well, it's mostly in the archaeological record. And I've done a lot of excavations, maybe not that many compared to the number that are out there, but trying to develop evidence for this, looking at the artifacts, looking at the animal bones. The animal bones that you find in these ancient sites are bones of, the food waste of the people. And they tell you how good they were at taking energy out of nature and building it into people. And I see a big change in that at about 50,000 years ago, and also in other aspects of behavior. We get the first real art. Now, this is the question, what is art? I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but art is in the eye of the beholder, don't you think? I mean, everybody knows the judicial definition of pornography. You know it when you see it. They've never been able to pin it down, write it down. Well, art, in a broad sense, is kind of like that, too. And so some of us think that, that there's art. There are people who will look at something that's actually 500,000 years old, a mussel shell, half of a mussel from Java, and it's got some scratch marks on it, and that was published in Nature magazine as art. I don't see that. I only see art after 50,000 years ago, and I'll get art that everybody will recognize as art, that isn't just in the eye of the beholder, it's in the eye of all beholders. And I'll say more about that as I go on here. Now, the question is, you get this art. So you get this behavioral change 50,000 years ago. The first art, there are advances in the ability to hunt and gather. That's very important in allowing people to spread. What's behind that? Now, this is really controversial. And I've always felt, from the time I first got into this, that it was genetic change. Now, genetic change occurs spontaneously or, opportunistically. You can't look forward and say, well, this genetic change is going to occur. You can't even look backwards and retrodict whenever genetic change would occur. We understand how these, genes can change physically and chemically more or less by chance. I used to think that at 50,000 years ago that there might have been just one or a very small number of gene changes, particularly in a gene that might have been crucial in allowing modern communication. You may have heard of the FOXP2 gene, which could have been such a thing. It turns out it's not. But I used to think it was just a small number of mutations. That doesn't work, because it's now possible to look at the genome in great detail and to determine whether there were genes that only became what they are today 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 years ago. And particularly, of course, genes involved in cognition and communication, and there weren't. The genes that are important in cognition and communication in us have been around for at least 300,000 years. So then the question is, if there was a genetic change 50,000 years ago, it wasn't in individual genes, it had to be in combinations or constellations of genes. And I've just written about this, pushing this. There's a very well-known ancient geneticist. He's not ancient, he's actually in his early 40s, kind of young from my point of view. But somebody who studies ancient DNA at Harvard, David Reich, he's written a book on ancient DNA, which I would highly recommend, although, it can be, he's kind of combative and it can be a little offensive, but it's very informative. Anyway, he suggested to me that it couldn't be single mutations because there were no genes that mutated after 300,000 years ago to their current form that are involved in communication and cognition. But a combination of genes could have arisen as a result of new mixtures of populations, that kind of thing. And that's what I think now. I've just written about this now. It's highly speculative. What we do need, but more than anything else in Africa, we have a few fossils. It's not as rich a record as we might like, but we particularly need ancient DNA. Almost all the ancient DNA work that's been done has been done in Europe, Eurasia. And you've probably heard that based on ancient DNA, we have the DNA of the Neanderthals. I never would have believed that was possible. It's only 20 years since it was done. But there it is. And David Reich, whose name I just mentioned, was able to show that the Neanderthals shared genes, or we'll put it the other way around, modern Eurasians share genes with the Neanderthals. They don't share with modern Africans, and yet those modern Eurasians have their ultimate origin in Africa. So where did those few genes that they share with Neanderthals come from? Only one place, Neanderthals. So there must have been, when modern humans spread to Europe, where the Neanderthals were emplaced, they must have exchanged genes with them on occasion, interbred with them. Okay, so I'll come back to that. But I think genetic change is what's involved here. Now, I'm not a minority of one, maybe I'm a minority of three. Reich believes that too, and somebody he worked with quite closely, Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, also believes that, but most people don't. So let me just back up a little bit and give you some background here, a little bit of introduction to all of human evolution. This is a table of firsts, and it's not just, in fact, just people on here. Is this going to show a cursor? No, I don't think so. Anyway, if you look down at the lower right-hand corner here, you can see we're going right back to the age of the Earth. So I had to make a choice here between glasses, and you can either do this kind of thing or I can peer. But I think down there it says 15,000 billion years. So it's a long time ago. That's the age of the solar system, basically, and the age of the Earth afterwards. I'm not going to talk anything about that, although I have other firsts going up. You can see somewhere there at about 65, 66 million years. MA is an abbreviation for millions of years ago. We get the first primates. That's the great group of mammals to which we belong. The closest relatives that we have today, the chimpanzee, the gorilla, the orangutan, they're primates, but there are also monkeys and a variety of other creatures that belong to a particular zoological order called the primates. And the oldest reliable fossil evidence we have for that is about 65 million years. You can see that here, and then a bunch of other firsts. So let me go ahead, and the first I want to emphasize are the ones in that rectangle. These are ones that have to do with human evolution. So the first humans, they're called hominines. That's the technical term today. It used to be hominids, but it's hominine. I can explain why that is, but hominin is a technical term. Supposedly, to be a hominin, you have to be bipedal. Hominines are all creatures on our side of the human-chimp divide. Chimps are our closest living relatives. Chimps and humans shared a common ancestor probably around 7 million years ago. And chimps went their way, and we went ours, or our ancestors went ours. Now, the fossil record for that split at 7 to 5 million years ago could be a lot denser than it is. And I'm not going to get into that very much, but I did think it was important to put what I'm going to say today into context. Then you see a bunch of other firsts here. First hominines in Europe, say about 1.7 to 1.4 million years ago. You can see there I've got the oldest evidence for fire. Now it's always a debatable issue whether something is evidence for fire or not. Are a few pieces of charcoal in an ancient site evidence for human control of fire? Obviously not. But most people would say probably around, what have I got in here, about 200,000 years ago. That's when we get the first built horse. You dig an archaeological site, you get a circle of stones around a bunch of burnt pieces of something, could be bone mostly, maybe sometimes wood, ash. That's at about 200,000 years. That's a very important part of the human adaptation, isn't it? And if you're going to make a living in Eurasia, you've got to have that. So let's say 200,000 years for that. And then you go on up and you can see the first fully modern humans. I've got them here at 50,000 years. And then there's some events after that that are very important and that are often discussed in anthropology courses. The origins of agriculture. Let's say, if I got that on here, I hope I do. Yeah, first farmers at about 11,000 years. Actually, just before that, I've got 13,000 years for just before that, for the first Americans. Some people would push that back a little further than that, maybe to as much as 17,000 years. All these issues are debatable, and every one of them you can get people arguing on one side or another. Anyway, this is just to give context here. Now, when I say first, I mean, this is the oldest evidence. It isn't necessarily the first, although I would say the first modern humans are not just the oldest modern humans at 50,000 years, so they're the same thing. Now, this is a family tree of all humans, all human species that I know and recognize anyway. You see there are lots of them. When I was a graduate student, gosh, I was thinking, when I was a graduate student, there were no human fossils to talk about, except the ones that were still walking around on campuses. So we knew that human evolution was very simple. I mean, to begin with, you had a bunch of creatures that were kind of like bipedal apes. They walked around on two legs, but they looked like apes in most of their bodies and certainly in their heads and faces. We called them the Australopithecines. And then after that, there was a human species called Homo erectus, which had evolved from one of the Australopiths or Australopithecines. And then out of Homo erectus, I suppose you could say there was Homo sapiens, maybe one or two other further species. Very simple picture. And if we were horses, that would be a perfectly satisfactory story today, because we wouldn't care much more than to know that. Now we have all these other human species. Almost everything on here, at least before, you can see MA again there, everything before, say, 200,000 years ago, was discovered in fairly recent times. So this tree has gotten a lot more elaborate. Lots of branches, and it isn't a simple ladder, one species leading to another. Branches, often they become extinct. So I've got a bunch of stages here. Back here, this is the 5 to 7 million year interval. And there are creatures back there that might be hominines, humans. Now, how would we tell? Well, they have to be bipedal. They have to walk around on two legs. Actually, I'm getting to be tripedal. You might see my cane here. So I'm evolving either into something new or backwards. I'm not sure. But in any case, bipedalism is the defining characteristic of the hominids, of humanity. And if you don't have bones that demonstrate bipedalism, the best bones are from the lower limb. Pelvis works, obviously the bones of the leg and the foot work. You can't really be sure. I mean, you can look at teeth, you can look at skulls, and you can say, well, I see something human in those, but when you're back at 5 to 7 million years ago, there can be a lot of debate about whether what you see as human really is human. We don't have anything between 5 and 7 million years that is demonstrably, unquestionably bipedal. So I've got this as a possible hominine stage. And then you have the Australopith stage. These are creatures who were unquestionably bipedal. We have lots of bones. The oldest of them to demonstrate bipedalism, let's see, I can't make the cursor work here, but it's one of these. It's not really important to point out which one. At about 4.1, 4.2 million years, we actually have a fossil of a lower leg bone from somebody that was unquestionably bipedal. We have other fossils now, too, going back to about that time interval, that indicate that by that time we have genuine bipedal humans, hominines, use the technical term around. And these creatures would have, if you were to encounter one on campus or go off to walk around East Africa a little bit, you'd see somebody like this in the distance and you'd say, it looks a lot like a chimpanzee, but it's walking around on two legs. Chimpanzees are habitually four-legged, quadrupedal. They curl their hands into, and walk on their knuckles, and most of the time, when they're moving, they're on all fours. They get up on two legs for very special purposes. They don't spend much time there. It's uncomfortable for them. They can't keep their balance the way we can, or at least the way most of us can. Maybe not me anymore. But anyway, so there's a stage there. I've got it here from about, let's say, 5 million to 2.5 million, when these are the only kinds of hominines that were around. Out of creatures like this must have evolved our own more direct ancestors in the genus Homo. And that's what I've got here. There's an early Homo stage, and there are a lot of species in there. Not all of them obviously can be ancestral to us. Only one can be, and there's a lot of debate about this. I've got one on here called Homo ergaster, which you can see more or less in the middle of that. Is that a green box? I'm colorblind, but I think it's green. Anyway, you can see Homo ergaster in the middle there. That, I think, is the stem species for all later hominins. But there were other species of Homo, and some that are still being discovered, including this fantastic, actually puzzling thing called Homo naledi in South Africa, which I've got on here, but I don't have any time to talk about now. A very late surviving, strange-looking species that was bipedal is not ancestral to us for sure, but coincided or at least lived at the same time as us. And then you have this late Homo stage, advanced Homo stage. And here you can see that we're in the middle of there, Homo sapiens, and then over to the left, if I've done this right, we're not quite in the middle, are we? No, we're second to the right. Homo sapiens, and to the right of Homo sapiens is Homo neanderthalensis. Those are the Neanderthals, and then further over to the right, there are yet other species. There were people who were living in the Far East, say, 100,000 years ago, disappeared about 50,000 years ago, who I think are late Homo erectus, so-called. What happened when modern humans spread out of Africa about 50,000 years ago? The first people they would have encountered would have been the Neanderthals. First Eurasians, non-modern Eurasians, would have been the Neanderthals who were living in Europe. But then as they spread eastwards, they would have eventually encountered these Homo erectus people that lived in the Far East. And everybody that they encountered became extinct, usually fairly quickly, although maybe with some gene exchange. There's another group of people who we don't know very much about what they look like. They're on this chart here. It's just Denisovans between Homo neanderthalensis and Homo erectus. I think they are Homo erectus. We only know them genetically, but I think that it'll turn out that they are the same people that we call Homo erectus. Now, there are other species on here I could talk about, but I don't think I should take your time. I want to make sure I don't go too far, too long. People here, how many people have notebooks or laptops open? When I don't lecture with a watch, so I rely on the students, which they're very reliable. Those laptops go down, time to stop. Anyway, how do you know whether you've got a modern human or not? Well, there are lots of ways in which we differ anatomically from the people who preceded us, and I just thought I'd show you something here. Take the Neanderthals, who lived very recently in the entire course of human evolution. They evolved in Europe beginning perhaps 400,000 years ago, and they disappeared in Europe and parts of Western Asia about 40 to 50,000 years ago. And they're easy to recognize, so it's not difficult when you have reasonably complete fossils to know whether you have a Neanderthal or not. I thought you might be interested in seeing how this is done. The skull on the left is a modern human. The skull on the right is a Neanderthal. The thing that's called the brain case, the part of the skull that contains the brain. In us, it's very high and relatively short from fore to back, high above the ear. In Neanderthals, much lower above the ear and much longer from fore to back. And then the face is very different too. So in us, the face is tucked in underneath the forepart of the brain, very, sort of a flat face underneath what would be the front of the brain. In Neanderthals, it's out in front. Not difficult once you've looked at one or two of these things to make the distinction. And these other human species can also be distinguished in the same way, mostly on skulls and teeth. Now, I said that the Neanderthals evolved in Europe. The oldest one we have, the oldest convincing fossil, is from a place called the Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain. It dates to about 430,000 years ago, and you see a skull there. It's a spectacular sight, provided thousands of Neanderthal fossils, including a complete skull, or nearly complete skull. And what it has some very distinctive Neanderthal features. The face is way out in front of the rest of the skull, as in Neanderthals. And in particular, if you wanted to be a Neanderthal, and I realize not many people do, but if you wanted to be, your face was totally plastic. You put your fingers on your nose and pull out about 2 inches. Everything else would sweep back like you had permanent mumps, and your face would be out in front of the rest. But not just your face, but the midline of the face, along the nose and between the upper teeth. And we can already see that in this 430,000-year-old fossil, which could then be an ancestor of the Neanderthals. Below it is a Neanderthal from France, dated to about 70,000 years ago, that shows this feature very clearly. And then over on the right, there's a skull from Morocco dated to about 300,000 years ago that seems to have something like a modern human face. I don't know. I mean, I'm a close colleague who's described this, and I'm more than willing to help him make his case. I don't know whether that's a modern human face too, but it's much different than a Neanderthal face, much flatter, certainly below the brow ridge, below the bar bone across the eyes. And then there's a skull from Ethiopia, from a place called Herto, dated there, putatively dated to about 160,000 years old. That's a modern human skull, a big one. Bigger, I mean, we tend to think that brain size must be everything. It's not. Our skulls are smaller than our ancestors of, say, 20, 15,000 years ago. That skull is really big. The average in this room would probably be about 1375 cubic centimeters on the inside. Neanderthals were 1450 to 1500, and that is up there with the Neanderthals, very large. But it's rugged, and it's different in some detailed respects from a modern human skull. I would say it's not fully anatomically modern, but it does show that modern humans were originating in Africa at the same time that the Neanderthals were evolving in Europe. Now we have genes to deal with. Oh, I wanted to show you this. Now, technically, I shouldn't do this. This is a skull. It's sitting on its top, sitting on its crown, but I turned in a box of sand, but I turned it over for this picture. This is a skull which I was very fortunate to come into possession of about a year and a half or 2 years ago. It's from a site you can see here. You can see the city of Cape Town on the map over in the upper left-hand corner. And there's a place called GMC1. It's a town called Saldanha. It's about an hour's drive north of Cape Town. And the skull came out of a crevice. You can see in the lower left-hand corner here. There was a crevice in a sandstone cliff, and it was full of bones. Now, I didn't discover this. This was discovered by construction workers who were making a fence to protect the cliff face or make it so that the cliff face couldn't fall on a road alongside there. You can see the fence there. And they opened up this crevice, and they found a lot of bones, mostly animal bones, of course. And then there was this human skull. This is a modern human skull, more or less. Now, how old is this thing? Well, we've got ostrich eggshell with it, which you can date with radiocarbon very precisely. It's 53,000 radiocarbon years old. Okay. I would like to get a better date than that, because that's kind of the minimum for radiocarbon. I think it's probably more like 70 to 80,000 years. We're having a very difficult time getting a better date than greater than 53,000. Hard to get a better date than that. Anyway, you can maybe, if you look at it, you can see what I've labeled as the brow ridge. It continues right across the bridge of the nose. And if you feel you're on your own skull, particularly if you're male, males tend to have bigger brow ridges than females, you won't feel the continuation across there. This is a modern human skull in most respects, but it still shows features that aren't fully modern. So I'm hoping, as I say, I'm not supposed to talk about this because we want to publish this, my colleagues and I, and the places where you might publish don't like it publicized in advance because then they don't have a press conference when it gets published. Anyway, I want to say a couple words about the genes. The genes have been very important. In fact, it was genes that first showed us conclusively that modern humans originated in Africa before 50,000 years ago. And this was work done by Alan Wilson and his students at the University of California in Berkeley. They were working with mitochondrial DNA, which is a kind of DNA that you inherit that is inherited exclusively through the female line. It's not in the nucleus of the cell. It's out there in little organelles that are out in the cell itself called mitochondria. It's a small genome. I mean, I don't know what the latest estimate is for how many base pairs, constituent elements there is in the genome, the full human genome, but it's, 3 billion, something more than that? The mitochondrial genome is only 16,500 of these constituents. It's small, but it's very distinctive. You can usually tell the species of a creature from it, and it's often used. So there are lots and lots of copies of it that you can retrieve from fossil bone, and it will tell you what species you're dealing with, and it does distinguish Neanderthals from modern humans. Now, even before we had Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA, though, what Wilson and his students showed was things I'll go through this quickly because I don't want to take up too much time. But they showed that the diversity of mitochondrial DNA was greater in Africa than it was anywhere else on the planet, and that the African diversity encompassed the diversity of mitochondrial DNA in Eurasia, and of course, Australia and the Americas. Suggested it's been evolving longer. Evolving means it started with a single kind of mitochondrial DNA. If you can believe this, a single woman's mitochondrial DNA was actually ancestral to all the mitochondrial DNA types that are around today. And her mitochondrial DNA diversified into lots of different kinds, which we now see today, many, many, many different kinds. And if you think you know the rate of diversification, which is called the mutation rate, you can actually calculate when she lived. She's sometimes been called mitochondrial Eve. And she presumably lived sometime between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago based on the mutation rate. There's a comparable thing, of course, in males, the Y chromosome, which is only passed on through males, and only males have it. And you can, again, look at the diversity and the mutation rate and try and work out what the person who was responsible for all the Y chromosome DNA you see today, when that person lived. And that comes out about the same, which is good. And that person is known as Y chromosome Adam. Okay, so this is just, this isn't really something I want to focus on, but I think it's important to understand. There's a chart there, and you can read the caption that shows you something about the diversity. And this is a nuclear genome, mitochondrial DNA, and it's not the Y chromosome either. It's something else. This field of genetics and its bearing on modern human origins is just blossoming. Anyway, you can maybe see here that there are a bunch of populations there that are modern humans outside of Africa. Ones that are on branches closer to one another have DNA that's more like the other branch that's closest to them. And then there are a bunch of Africans down below, and they are also they're more diverse actually than the Eurasians outside of Africa. And then you have Neanderthals down at the bottom. We actually have mitochondrial DNA, and DNA of this kind too, I should say, nuclear DNA from Neanderthals, and they're quite different, on a totally different evolutionary trajectory in terms of their DNA. Even if they managed somehow, as they were contacted by modern humans in Europe, Western Asia, 50,000 years ago, even if there was some interbreeding, and some Neanderthal genes got into us. The amount is debatable. I think if we were to be able to test people in this room, it'd be somewhere between 1% and 2% average that we would have in Neanderthal DNA. Anyway, the DNA is a very powerful argument for the exclusively African origin of modern humans. All right. So I said that about 50,000 years ago, people who were already modern, and they were modern in their anatomy and, of course, in their genes, spread very rapidly from Africa. And the evidence is that they had begun to behave in a very different kind of way, much more successful hunting and gathering. They produced the first art that I would call art and so forth. And then most people that I know, most specialists would say, okay, pretty good evidence for this change at 50,000 years, and that's presumably what prompted the African expansion out of Africa. It's called the African diaspora. Now, the question is, what explains these behavioral innovations at 50,000 years ago? I think it's genes, but there are other possibilities. I think the most popular one is that between 100,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago, human populations in Africa were growing. That would mean that there would now be more people inventing things, and then inventions would be less likely to be lost by chance because there'd be more people to remember them. And eventually, at say 50,000 years ago, you cross a kind of threshold, and now all those inventions in there, and you've got modern human behavior. All the features of the artifact record that I think of as modern would be there. Possible. I don't know why human populations would have been growing in Africa between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. You still need an explanation for that. And I think I can show that, as I'll show you very quickly in a moment, that they weren't. So the alternative is a new constellation of genes that promoted modern cognition, modern communication, and produced the inventiveness that we associate with our species, the ability to innovate. Now, I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but in the interval between, say, 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, when modern humans were clearly evolving in Africa, climate was highly variable. We think it's, we're kind of entering a climate crisis today, but there must have been lots of climate crises back there. In Africa, it didn't actually ever really get cold. There were glacial periods in Europe and in the Americas, but it did get very dry at times. And when it got dry, areas that are today habitable and had been habitable before were abandoned. People had to leave them. And then it would get moist again, but not necessarily in the same place. People would come back. But in the process, populations got reshuffled. And so in the interval between 100,000 and 50,000 years, you would get new genomes, new constellations of genes, just because there were now people being moved all the way around all over the continent by this climatic change, which was occurring with some frequency. So this is David Reich's idea, not mine, but I think that this is the kind of thing that could have produced the genetic change, boosted human cognition and communication in 60 to 50,000 years ago. Now, I just wanted to tell you, I thought you might be interested. How are we doing? Well, I can't see that clock very well, but don't hesitate to say you've said enough. Stop. Anyway, about 50,000 years ago, the kinds of people who made what we call later Stone Age tools in Africa, later Stone Age artifacts, I should say, replaced their predecessors who made Middle Stone Age artifacts. Now, these later Stone Age people were presumably the ancestors of those who spread to Europe, where they made other kinds of artifacts, very similar to the ones that were being made in Africa. It's similar enough so that you can recognize the similarities. The most important thing that you can recognize after 50,000 years, first in Africa and then in Europe, is art, unequivocal art. So there are sites in Africa, I've just written about this, that are dated to about 50,000 years ago, maybe a little bit after, no more than 45,000 years ago or so, that have the oldest unquestionable jewelry, ostrich eggshell beads. You see pieces of ostrich eggshell there. Those were being made into a bead. You didn't make the bead and then put the hole in it. You sort of cut out the bead in the or make the hole, and then cut out the bead around the hole in the whole piece of ostrich eggshell. We get the first indication. These are genuine ornaments, jewelry, and they're, people still make them today, so we know how this was done. The oldest evidence for that is about 50,000 years. It seems to have occurred right across sub-Saharan Africa. In Europe, when these people reached Europe, they produced spectacular art. And there's a figurine from Germany. It's more than 35,000 years old, probably more like 50, 45 again. No question about that being art, right? Everybody agrees. Looks like it could have been produced by one of Hugh Hefner's ancestors. It's actually, the female features are very obvious, but if you look for the head. There's a loop there. Somebody was wearing this around their neck. It's only 2 inches long. So was that person a male or a female? Who knows? We get a lot of art like this in Europe, where, of course, the art is extremely well known. It's well preserved, showing exaggerated female features. Excuse me, exaggerated female features. And you can argue about what this is. I think it's about fertility, but that's just my guess, because we can see that in historic hunter-gatherers, that they're very concerned about keeping themselves going, and fertility is a very important aspect. I think, but you can, if you want, you can make that pornography. It doesn't matter. And then, of course, in Europe, we also get the famous cave art. Why don't we have more of this in Africa? Why? I showed you the beads there. We just don't have the density of the record in Africa, and there haven't been the archaeologists and others who dig stuff up in Africa the way there have been in Europe for decades. So most of the evidence for the art and the change in behavior after 50,000 years ago, particularly focused on the art, comes from Europe. But we do have it from Africa, too. It's just not as abundant. Okay. So these Middle Stone Age people who lived between, let's say, 100 and 50,000 years ago, there are different variants of the different artifact assemblages that have been given names. There's a variant called the Stilbe variant, which existed at about, let's say, 75,000 years ago. And supposedly there's art there. Now, if there was art, see why this is important, because that would mean that art may have been developing gradually. I think it appeared explosively, but you could argue it appeared gradually. Here's in the lower, I'm sorry, I can't use the cursor, but in the lower left-hand panel, in the middle of it, you see a piece of rock. Actually, just below that, there's a schematic drawing of it. It's got a box of sorts, a rectangle with X's incised in it. This has been considered by many people the oldest example of art in the world at 75,000 years. Is it art? I don't know. I mean, it would be very abstract. I would be much more impressed by this if it were the outline of a human or even an animal. There are lots of other pieces of this. Is made in ironstone. It's a pigment that people collected in large quantities. Lots of other pieces with marks on them, but nothing as patterned as this. So what would happen if people were, why would they cut into rock like this? Well, they were using the pigment. They wanted the powder. And they used that as a constituent in the glue that they used to stick stone points onto the ends of wooden spears. So if you're testing that to make sure that the powder is going to be successful, what you want, you're going to make marks like this. Now, occasionally, it's kind of like, if you give monkeys typewriters and enough time, they'll produce Hamlet. So if you give these people enough time, and boy, did they have time, tens of thousands of years, and enough pieces of this stone, I think eventually you'll get something that looks like that. Most of the pigment that we have that has marks on it doesn't look as patterned as that. It's just marks. But if you want, you can call it art. And then in the upper right, or actually over on the right-hand side of this particular panel, you see some shells. These are tiny things, about the size of your thumb. Size of your thumbnail. And they have holes through them. These are things that grow on estuarine grasses just off the coast of Africa. And the holes are not humanly produced, at least not obviously humanly produced, but they are holes, and maybe people were stringing these things as beads. That would be art of a sort. I mean, if you're going to say that those ostrich eggshell things is art, which I would say jewelry, then I suppose this could be ancestral jewelry. I'm not convinced. There's another variant of the Middle Stone Age that existed, let's say, 60,000 years ago. It's got another name there. It's called the Howson Fort. And at two sites in the deposits that are associated with this kind of Middle Stone Age, there are pieces of ostrich eggshell. You can see them in the lower right-hand corner, and they have incised marks on them. And it does look like this is intentional incising, engraving on ostrich eggshell, which people were still doing historically. The problem is that both these sites, this is the Middle Stone Age, the kind of Middle Stone Age crops out right at the surface of the site, and these pieces come from 50 centimeters below, let's say a foot and a half below. And people who lived here long after 50,000 or 60,000 years ago would bury ostrich eggshell canteens. They made canteens, put water in them, and then would bury them to come back later when they needed the water. They bury them about, what, 1.5 feet below the surface. And if these things, people forgot to come back for these and they fell apart, this is what you'd have. Now, you could determine whether these things were actually maybe not 60,000 years old, but certainly a lot older than I think they are. I think they're probably like 5 to 10 with radiocarbon. I haven't been able to get the people who found these things to do radiocarbon. See, we know how old they are. Well, I don't think we do. Anyway, that would be those are the best examples I can show you of art from before 50,000 years ago, and I don't find them compelling. There are other examples I can show you which I think are even less compelling. But the art that comes afterwards, everybody would recognize that as art. And some of this European stuff, you could put it in the Met, and people would come to look at it. And, they would be very impressed. And the artists, there's no build-up. It's not as if they started out, I think I'll try to make a human figurine, and they don't do a very good job, and then they do better through time. No. When they produce something that's obviously a human figurine, female figurine, it is perfect. I mean, they really were very good. And this happens almost instantaneously at about 45 to 50,000 years ago. Now, in South Africa, I know what I can do. I have a phone that will have my time on it. Will have the time on it. Okay. So I won't go on too much longer. I just want to tell you about this, because if you want to test the idea that populations were growing between about 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, what kind of evidence could you get in the fossil or archaeological record? Well, in South Africa, where I work, people who lived there for at least the last 100,000 years collected shellfish in large numbers, made what are called middens, tens of thousands of shellfish, which they accumulated over time. And in particular, there's this kind that's called a limpet. You see a picture of one. There are lots of different species of limpets. They're also known as sea snails or gastropods. And their size is presumably, the average size is presumably a reflection of the extent to which people are preying on them. If you prey on, they're not like us. They grow to a certain size, then they die. But they don't, we grow to a certain size and we continue on at that size for long periods of time. Not true with these things. And therefore, if you press hard on them, you will drive the average size down. And that would be a reflection of what? Why would the shells in a particular site be smaller in one site on average than another? Well, more people. More people that are collecting these things, they're going to pick up the biggest ones first. Those are the ones that are most visible. They have the most food value. So the average size of the limpets, like this one, in an ancient site, tells you something about the number of people, not in relative terms, that we're collecting. So I've looked at this a lot, and here, let's go right to this, because I want to be able to show you a few pictures of some of these African sites. This is South Africa. Here you see the west coast over on the left of the map, and the south coast on the bottom. And there are these sites with shellfish, Middle and Later Stone Age sites on both coasts, and they're full of these. They're just full of these shellfish. I mean, tens of thousands. It takes forever to excavate them, and even longer to separate them into different kinds and then measure them. So you can measure them, and you can see you can figure out what the average size was at any given time. It turns out, just to make a long story short, it turns out that if you go back beyond 50,000 years, they're always much larger on average than they are afterwards. That would say to me that there weren't that many people, at least there's not as many people before 50 as after. And what's more, you can look, and what this chart shows you, between, let's say, 120,000 and 50,000 years ago, the shellfish aren't getting smaller. They're always about the same size. Now, I haven't explained the format for this chart, but over to the right, when you see box plots that are over to the right, it means bigger shellfish, and over to the left, it means smaller ones. This is a particular species called the Cape Turban shell. And they're always, and this is true of every other species of gastropod that you can excavate from these sites, always, on average, much bigger before 50,000 than after. So that says that I think that populations were much smaller then, and they weren't getting bigger because the shells don't change in size in a systematic way. This is that yellow box there is showing you the sizes of this particular species in the deposits that have presumably produced ancient art, which I don't think is art. But okay. So I'm going to go through this quickly because I realize I don't have much time. One of the questions that always intrigues people is, how do you find ancient sites? How do you find ancient fossils? Mostly I go out and I look, but there's no way they're found. You rely on construction activity, mining, that kind of thing. And there's a place here. I'll go back and take this. There's a place called Easterfontein. I hope you can see it. It's in the middle panel there, Easterfontein 1. This is a holiday community north of Cape Town. And I excavated a site there for many years. When I say excavated, I mean I watched other people excavate it. But that's typically the way people like me speak, is if you did the work yourself. Anyway, there are some 4 meters, let's say 14 feet of deposit full of these shells. They're all Middle Stone Age shells. And I thought you might be interested in how a site like this is discovered. I worked there for a very long time. I'm going to skip that and just go. Okay, let's just go to this. So you can see the circle there. That's the site. It's in the side of a cliff. A colleague of mine and I used to take the road. You can see the road going down by the sea here by this cliff. Drive down there. And one day we were driving down there. It wasn't a paved road like it is there. And there is in this picture. And there were all these shells and artifacts and things falling out of the side of the cliff. And when we went up there, we discovered they were in place. There was evidence for fire and everything else. So it was one of these sites that we now think, we know is more than 50,000 years old based on radiocarbon. We have other dates that might mean it's 115,000 years old. I don't know whether I believe those dates or not. But here you see the site being excavated. We had to build a platform to get up there onto the cliff face so that we could dig into it. We had a shipping container which we used as a kind of site office, which was very handy. We were doing this in June, July, August, which is the rainy season here, and rain sometimes. So we could retreat into this shipping container. You see it cutting through the deposits in the lower right-hand panel here, and you see the black at the bottom. That's fire. People were burning fires in this site. Now, nothing surprising about that because we have older evidence than this, but it was very common for them to do that. Everything you see sticking out of the deposit, except for the tags that we stuck in to show the different levels we were excavating, is a shell. And there are lots of artifacts. There's some of the artifacts there, stone artifacts. They don't look like much, but if you're into this kind of thing, they're pretty nice. They made a lot of things with nice sawtooth edges. What they were doing with them, we can argue about. And then lots of animal remains. There were remains of terrestrial animals like little antelopes and things of that sort. Remains of marine creatures. You see a seal there, the Cape Fur seal, which is still there, and the African penguin, which is still there. Lots of tortoise bones. You see the tortoise. What there wasn't, it's very surprising, no fish bones. Now you stand there today and look down, and there's fish everywhere. You can see them in the water. So how is it that, in fact, these people who must have seen the fish, how is it that they didn't get them? Well, I don't think they had the technology. The technology for fishing, net sinkers, things that look like fish hooks, that's all after 50,000 years. So that's a major change in human ability to take energy out of nature and build it in people. And I think it took the modern human mind to invent the technology. There's a rock at low tide with some of these shells on it at this site. And here's another one of these sea snails from this particular site. And in the bottom right of this slide, there are the average sizes in the sort of, is that pink or gray? I don't know. In that gray box. And again, the ones that are over to the right are bigger. Ones over to the left are smaller. The ones over to the left are all much younger than 50,000 years. The ones over to the right are older than 50,000. There's some stuff on the top, which I wish I had time to talk about, but it isn't archaeological. It's the things from the bottom and then just above. And this is, it's the same pattern everywhere. It doesn't matter which coast you're on or which species you're dealing with. So I don't think populations were changing during this interval. I think they were stable and small. Okay. So what about, other differences between so-called Middle Stone Age people before 50,000 and Later Stone Age people afterwards? Well, one is no fish bones, or very few fish bones in sites older than 50,000 years, and they dominate sites younger. When you want to look at mammal bones, which I'm interested in, you have to brush away all the fish bones in sites that are younger than 50,000 years. Something else, the shellfish that people collected after 50,000 years, a much wider variety of species, including some very rare ones, which I think was because, people are out there, they're combing these rocks, and they're going to pick up anything they see because there are lots of them, lots of people, and they want whatever they can find. Before 50,000 years ago, with fewer people, they could be more selective. They just didn't care about a lot of the shellfish. So this is the tortoise. Now, the tortoise shows the same pattern. It may not be quite so clear on the slide, but they're bigger before 50,000 years ago than after. And they're like shellfish. They're not like us. They grow to a certain size. Their physiology collapses and they die. And if you collect lots of them before they get to that maximum size, you will push down the average size. And the average size is smaller after 50,000 years than before, just like with the shellfish. So, let's see. Okay. So, to me, this means that there was a major change 50,000 years ago, that the Middle Stone Age was not just something like the Later Stone Age and then changed to become the Later Stone Age. So here's, this is, I won't go through this because I don't think I should take the time, but this is my idea on this. I think there was genetic change. I think it has a lot to do with the nature of climatic change in Africa and the reshuffling of populations and remaking of genomes, including occasionally one that actually did enhance human ability to hunt and gather, to produce art and stuff like that. And when this genome was fixed at about 50,000 years ago, suddenly you've got fully modern people in Africa, and just as suddenly they're out of Africa and they're all over Eurasia by 40,000 years ago. All right, I think I should stop there, and maybe there'll be questions. I do have the power to count people's minds, and so I'd be glad for questions if I can. I should remind you, if you have questions, that what I've been telling you is my view, but I believe in it pretty strongly. And you could maybe have somebody here in the future who might give you a different one.
A couple of questions. Your research that you did on the size of crustaceans or whatever they're called seem to be all in South Africa, and I'm wondering if similar studies have been made in Central and North Africa, because it's a huge continent, and the people that went to Europe may have come from Middle or Northern Africa, where populations could have been different.
Well, the most of the evidence for ancient shellfishing and for these changes in size that I've reported comes from South Africa. There's something special about South African coast, and we have sites there that we don't have elsewhere in Africa. The only other place in Africa where we have anything comparable is Northwest Africa, Morocco, and a little bit in Tunisia. And it seems to be the same. I say seems because I haven't seen much of it published, but I have a former student who's worked there, and she says that it's the same thing with, when you look at the limpets, and they're much bigger before 50,000 than afterwards. So it would be nice to have evidence from elsewhere. Did the Neanderthal shellfish? That's an interesting question. They seem to have, but we don't, but we don't really have much evidence for it, and we have remarkably little evidence for shellfishing by people who were modern in Europe after 50,000 years ago. I think that has to do with, they did it, but I think it has to do with the sites being submerged now. So we're not finding them. It would be interesting to know. I would expect that we would find again that the Neanderthal sea snails were bigger than the ones, the Cro-Magnons who lived after them. The evidence is obviously is crucial. I mean, how do you deal with a story like this? The evidence constrains. But getting that evidence is not so simple. Those charts that I showed you, which I hope weren't too overwhelming, there's months and months and months of work behind those, in excavating the shells and identifying them and then measuring them. When I was digging this Eysterfontein site, I got so interested, so excited by measuring, that I was gluing together shells so that they would be measurable. I never thought I'd do anything like that. You get these fragmentary shells, go through a pile of shells, and I'd see pieces that I thought I could fit together to make a whole shell. I spent a lot of time at that. And, maybe I should be institutionalized for that. I don't know. No, because it was not fun, and it was kind of mind-dulling. But I had a purpose. So, and I think it's compelling that the people who lived before 50,000 years ago in Africa were much less numerous than people who lived after. Why would that be? Basically same environment. The only reason I can think of is that they weren't as sophisticated in extracting energy out of nature. And then at 50,000 years, everything changes. We get the Australasian beads. We get other. It may be that we even have some rock art in the form of pieces of rock that are found in the ground that seem to have paintings on them. I wouldn't push that too hard because I don't know that the dating would be about 30,000 years. But it's not directly on the rock art. It's on charcoal in the same level, and I wouldn't want to push it too hard. I think you want to directly date these things more. But that would be interesting if we could show that there was the oldest rock art in Africa was 30,000 or more years old. That would be. I expect that it is, but we don't have much evidence to prove that. Yeah.
Hi.
I think.
Hi, I'm over here. Thank you for coming. I had a question about the difference between the gradual change in behavior versus an abrupt change. There were multiple exoduses out of Africa over the last 200,000 years or so, and there's different evidence for places outside of Africa for at least anatomically modern humans. So I was wondering why maybe there were certain behaviors that didn't come about until about the 50,000 year period, but maybe others did, and they were just less successful at.
Well, there were people who lived. I mean, yes, we can talk about multiple expansions from Africa. The most famous of the ones that have been proposed is in Israel, between, let's say, 115,000 and 90,000 years ago. There were people in Israel, I could show you pictures of them, who looked pretty modern. And oddly, they were replaced at maybe 80 to 90,000 years ago by Neanderthals. Now, is that an early out of Africa exodus? It didn't get any farther than Israel. And if you look at where Israel is today, it's hardly out of Africa. You look at the animals that are associated with these early modern fossils, so-called. I think they're near modern. I don't think they're modern. In Israel, hartebeest, warthog, African animals. Africa expanded a little bit, and with it, into what is today Israel, and with it came these near-modern, I call them near-modern humans, who are making very unsophisticated kinds of artifacts compared to people after 50,000 years ago. But no, you're right. I mean, there have been a number of proposals for earlier, or at least simultaneous, exits from Africa to the modern human one at 50,000 years ago. I don't believe them. I mean, part of the problem, prehistory is a strange thing. And you can make it what you want sometimes. And there are, I think, some of my colleagues whom I don't want to be disrespectful, but they think anything could have happened in prehistory and probably did. And that doesn't get you anywhere. You have to work with the evidence as best you can. I mean, would anybody, that female figurine that I showed from Hohlefels in Germany, that's art, right? That's a carved figurine in ivory. And anybody who could do that today would probably be a well-known artist. And nobody looking at that will say, no, that's not art. That's just something that happened. It's an accident. But everything older than 50,000 years ago, I think you can argue, is an accident. There's a figurine from a place on the Israeli-Syrian border that is made on a volcanic pebble. And that's said to be a figurine that looks to me like a pebble that maybe has some features of a human figurine. And it's been argued that it is, and it's 250,000 years old. So if you accept that, then yes, there's art back there 250,000 years ago. But I don't accept it. Now, maybe that's my bias. But I look at stuff like that, and there are other examples I could cite. And I say, no, I mean, you can make that art if you want. Again, art is in the eye of the beholder. And when you get all beholders saying it's art, then you've got art, from my point of view. And that's after 50,000. So, you're right. I mean, there are other exits that we should have, if you were, had more time to talk about them, how valid they seem. The Israeli one is often cited, and there are, would be, if you look at where Israel is and where these sites are, they're basically in Africa. So I don't know what I'd want to call it out of Africa. The first evidence we have for modern humans way out of Africa into Europe is after 50,000 years ago. Now, there was recently an article published, was it Science or Nature? I don't know, but about a 200,000-year-old modern human skull from a place in Greece. I don't think the date is worth anything. I mean, they dated the bone directly using a method that, depending on what part of the bone you date, you can get any date you want. And the skull is just a small fragment that I don't think tells you whether that was a modern human or a Neanderthal. And centimeters away from it in the deposit was a Neanderthal skull, complete and unquestionably Neanderthal. But there's stuff like that out there. And most of this stuff has a half-life of, 5 or 10 years, and it's gone. But when it's first announced, you have to be able to deal with it. And it always is announced in a way that makes it seem as if we now got to rewrite the entire prehistoric record. You see it in the New York Times, you see it in you see it in the New York Times. Could it be fake news? I don't know. It's not them, of course, that's promoting it. So it'd be unfair to criticize them for it.
All right, folks, I want to acknowledge that we are over time, so this will be the last question, but there is a public reception following this where you can continue to talk to Dr. Klein.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a quick question about the recent trend of finding hominid species that are related to, I guess I don't want to mess up my wording here, but Neanderthals, Denisovians, Homo naledi, things like that are very similar to human species and that were around contemporaneously. Do you think this trend will continue? We'll find more and more of these species that were very similar to humans, but also had capabilities that humans had at that time as well?
Okay, I'm not sure I heard everything, but I did hear Homo naledi. And of course, what Homo naledi is, this is bones that were found in two sites not too far from Johannesburg, not far from where, in fact, most of the Australopiths from South Africa have been found. The sites are very difficult to access, two caves that you have to slither down. In fact, the only people who've been down there are extremely thin women who can get down there and do a little excavation and bring these bones out. No question, these are very strange bones, and there are lots of them, and this Homo naledi thing is real. The date, who knows? It's been published as maybe 300,000 years, maybe 200,000 years, could be anything. But it's something separate from Homo sapiens, and it probably does overlap with some of the fossils that were assigned to very early Homo sapiens in Africa. So it's a separate thing. It's mysterious. I mean, how these bones got down there, people would have had to carry that. There were lots of bones, lots of individuals, at least 15 individuals from one of these sites. Somebody carried them down there. Why would they do that? And how did they see when they did it? It's one of the, I think, one of the most spectacular mysteries to emerge in paleoanthropology in the last few years. There's another sort of comparable thing. I don't think it's comparable. On the island of Flores, one of the Indonesian islands, there's a thing called Homo floresiensis, a tiny individual, maybe an adult woman at maybe 3 feet. And she's been assigned to the species Homo floresiensis, which supposedly survived in Flores until 60,000 years ago. I think it's a modern human that's got, it's very poorly excavated. I think it's a modern human with a pathology. But that's an ongoing, endless debate. People who think it's a pathological modern human, reduced in size, reduced in brain size in particular, as a result of a growth anomaly. And other people say, no, it's a fossil. I don't know that it's real or not. I mean, I wouldn't want to rule it out completely, but it's not like Homo naledi, which is real. And I have no explanation for it. I don't think the people who've been studying the bones think that this was some kind of ritual activity, an underground cemetery of some kind. Could be. There are no other bones but human bones down there. Homo naledi bones. And one of the sites, there are a couple other things, but hardly anything. No evidence that carnivores were carrying anything down there. It had to be people doing this. Who were they? Did they make artifacts or no artifacts there? Very strange. It can almost make you believe in special creation.
Well, Dr. Klein, this was fabulous, and I think it really underscores the value of this distinguished lecture series. And so we thank you so very much for coming, and thank Lenny and Bob for making this possible. So will you please join me in thanking Dr. Klein? We have a small memento to give you that you can take a bit of the Denver skyline home with you to California.
Thank you.
The prototype for this was made by faculty in our College of Architecture and Planning, and with Dr. Klein's name and the CU Denver Chancellor's distinguished lecture in today's date. So we're happy to
thank you very much.
this to you. As Kelly mentioned, we have a reception in the Spear Gallery that is on the lower level of this building. So if you just go down the stairs, there will be people leading the way. And we invite you to mark your calendars for about a month from now, October 23rd, will be our next distinguished lecture, and our speaker that night will be Mike Phillips, who is the director of the Turner Endangered Species Fund, and he will be discussing the return of the wolf to Colorado. So another fascinating presentation. So again, thank you all for coming, and please join us downstairs.